past few years, the internet has been asking what happened to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I include myself in that description. I cannot open my YouTube homepage without being flooded by a litany of videos containing MCU hot takes. And here I am, just adding to that deluge. I'm sorry, but sometimes you've got some thoughts and you just have to get them off of your chest. After all, this is one of the great issues of our time, so. How did this cultural landmark, the most popular franchise in cinematic history, occasional critical darling, and commercial success multiple times over, a franchise that unequivocally changed cinematic storytelling and the way movies are made forever, end up in such a dire state? It's not as if there was a change in the creative heads. The studio executives and producers have remained largely the same since the MCU's inception. The cast is also almost uniformly the same, so what happened? This is yet another autopsy on what I think led to the downfall of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't think it's as simple as saying that Kevin Feige and the rest of the creatives in charge didn't have a plan for this universe after the conclusion of Avengers Endgame. Truthfully, I don't think the overarching narrative of the MCU is as important as people think it is. I also don't think the reason for the MCU's waning popularity is due to something as stupid, innocuous, and hard to describe as the MCU going woke. Rather, the real reason for Marvel's decline has to do with the most basic aspect of storytelling, which is that Marvel Studios has taken these movies and these shows out of the hands of artists, making them feel like soulless, made for mass consumption corporate products instead of art made by people with a voice that have something to say. When talking about Marvel, I think it's important to keep a couple of things in mind. The biggest of which being the most common arguments that people have suggested as possibilities for Marvel's waning success. The single biggest point of discussion about Marvel since the release of Avengers Endgame is the idea of quantity over quality. When Disney Plus launched in the fourth quarter of 2019, it became a top priority for Disney to have plenty of original productions for their brand new shiny streaming service. In February of 2020, when our favorite recurring character on the channel, Bob Chapek, took over as CEO of Disney, he passed down an edict to not only Disney and Disney Animation, but every Disney owned studio, including Pixar, Lucasfilm, and Marvel, to significantly increase production. Marvel originally planned to release four projects in 2020: Black Widow, Eternals, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and WandaVision. However, when the world was turned upside down due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Marvel was forced to pivot away from their original strategy. Rather than release their theatrical slate straight to streaming or adopt a hybrid release strategy similar to Warner Brothers, Marvel pushed back all of their 2020 releases and decided to wait until it was safe for audiences to return to theaters in masse. This is what caused the bloated release schedule Marvel had in 2021. That year, Marvel released four movies and five TV shows. That year, Marvel released WandaVision, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Loki, Black Widow, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, What If, Eternals, Hawkeye, and Spider-Man No Way Home. What are we doing? Again, I will concede that the issue of quantity over quality is an issue for Marvel, especially in 2021 when they were absolutely oversaturating the market with their own productions. But I do not believe it is the sole reason for Marvel's decline. Rather, what I think happened is because there were so many Marvel projects in one year, it allowed people to really see the real issues they have with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think part of the reason that so many people were willing to watch all of these movies and TV shows in 2021 was that it represented the grand return of Marvel. 2020 was the year without heroes, both in reality and on the big screen. So the following year represented the grand return of not only the MCU, but superheroes on the big screen. This was happening during a time when we sorely needed them. So I think the audience was more than willing to sit through all of these MCU productions because at this point, Marvel had built up so much goodwill from their audience that we had no reason not to trust them. And that's why I myself sat down and happily watched all of WandaVision, all of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I went to watch Black Widow in theaters. I watched Loki. But I noticed as the year went on and I continued to engage with all of these Marvel productions, I found myself becoming tired and jaded with the MCU. I became extremely tired with the way that these movies looked and felt and moved and behaved. So, similar to what I said, I don't think the quantity of the productions in itself was the issue. I don't think that is the reason that Marvel has experienced such a sharp decline. But speaking for myself, and maybe for others, the sheer volume of releases from Marvel in 2021 allowed me to sit with all of these projects and really identify my issues with not only the MCU, but the way that the MCU goes about making movies and especially TV shows. The second most common talking point when it comes to discussing the decline of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the idea that Marvel did not have a plan after Avengers Endgame. Generally, when I see people talk about this, what they are referring to specifically is the grand overarching narrative of the MCU. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I do not believe that the overarching story of the MCU is all that important. I think this for a few reasons, but firstly, I will say that Marvel did not have the entire Infinity Saga mapped out when they first started with those Phase 1 movies. When Iron Man was released, when The Incredible Hulk was released, followed by Iron Man 2, Kevin Feige and co. did not, in their minds, say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this, and eventually where we want to get to is adapting Infinity Gauntlet. That is not what happened, despite what many people believe. The truth is that the MCU, specifically the Infinity Saga, was more or less a happy coincidence in the sense that when the MCU began, all Feige knew was that he wanted to lead up to an Avengers film, which at the time was in itself an unprecedented move to get all of these characters from their respective franchises and unite them on the big screen in one movie. That by itself was revolutionary, but he was not thinking 8 years down the road to where he wants to make Avengers Infinity War. In fact, if you go back and look at some of the interviews and articles that exist documenting the history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you will find that it was actually Joss Whedon's idea to include Thanos in the post-credits scene. So, despite the fact that Feige and the creative heads knew that they wanted to make an Avengers film, they were not thinking so far ahead that they wanted to get to this big confrontation with Thanos. Rather, Joss Whedon thought it would be a cool idea to include the post-credits scene of Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet, which would hint to something much, much bigger. And that brings me to the second reason that I don't believe that the overarching narrative of the MCU is all that important, which is the fact that the secret behind the MCU was not that you actually had to watch every single movie in order to understand these big event films like Avengers, like Age of Ultron. The secret to the MCU was that it felt like you had to watch every single movie. The post-credit scenes served a much different function in phases 1 through 3 than they do now. In phases 1 through 3, the post-credit scenes essentially served as little teasers for fans who were patient enough to sit through the credits, and maybe they would see something that would hint towards either the next movie or something that is coming several years down the line. Now, Marvel post-credits scene, which feels much more purposeless. There is almost no sense or rhythm to these post-credit scenes in Marvel, beginning from Phase 4 to the present. In fact, I would argue that many of the post-credit scenes that were shown in Phase 4 all the way through Phase 5 right now serve almost no purpose, because they essentially show something, they tease something, and it's never touched on again for several more movies. The truth is, in phases 1 through 3, you did not have to watch every single MCU movie in order to be in on the conversation. You didn't need to watch every single movie in order to enjoy the event films like The Avengers, Age of Ultron, or even Civil War. The truth is, you can watch The Avengers and have an enjoyable experience watching it as a standalone film. I would also argue that you could even watch something like Captain America Civil War, despite all of the layered characterization that goes into that film. You can watch Captain America Civil War on its own without having seen the previous MCU projects and still have a comfortable grasp on what that film is about. The story is comprehensible, everything is clear and succinct. That is the difference. You did not need to watch every single MCU production. Now that feels like a much different case, but all of this serves the point that the overarching narrative of the MCU is not what made it work in the first place. What made it work was this idea that it felt like you had to watch every MCU project. Whereas now, trying to keep up with every single Marvel movie and TV show on Disney Plus feels like homework. The final argument that I want to address is the idea that Marvel has not established a new main cast of characters. It just so happens that I think this is the single strongest argument that I've seen out of the most common that I tend to see online. When the MCU began, it was very clear that Marvel wanted to move forward with this universe based on the foundation that was established with Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor. It was clear that these three were our main heroes because each of these three characters received trilogies and were featured prominently in the crossover movies, such as the Avengers. However, once Avengers Endgame came to a conclusion and Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man died in that movie, Captain America retired, and Thor has had his character completely assassinated, there is no big three in the MCU anymore. Who is the main cast of characters? Even with the recent release of Captain America Brave New World, I still find myself asking, Who on earth is going to be on this Avengers team that is supposed to fight Doctor Doom only next year? Because for the life of me, I can't really think of the team that will be put together to fight such an imposing threat. This is the strongest argument because, in my opinion, it shows the lack of cohesion that is really happening here in the MCU. What made the MCU special prior to Phase 4 was not the storytelling, it wasn't the stories themselves, it definitely wasn't the filmmaking. What made the MCU special was the characters. Audiences really connected with people like Tony Stark, like Steve Rogers, like Thor, especially once Thor had his soft reboot with Thor Ragnarok and was made, I think, an even stronger character in Avengers Infinity War. People connected with these characters. If you were to ask someone what their favorite moment in the MCU is, I believe it's highly unlikely that they would say it's this big action set piece or some big twist or reveal in a respective movie. Rather, I think they would share an intimate character moment. It is the characters that drew people to these movies, and the characters are the reason that people stayed to watch these movies for over 10 years between 2008 to 2019. In fact, I would argue that the MCU really hit its stride when they started to have these characters interact with one another in their own standalone films. For example, bringing Black Widow into Captain America the Winter Soldier, seeing Steve and Natasha's dynamic develop over the course of that film is part of what made it so captivating and so strong. Another good example is the utilization of Hulk in Thor Ragnarok. Thor and Hulk's relationship in that movie is part of what made it so funny. Their comedic timing and rapport is part of the reason that Thor Ragnarok resonated so strongly with audiences. What do audiences have now? Which character are they latching onto? Does anybody feel particularly strongly about any of these new Marvel characters? Because I cannot think of a single person. A lot of people claimed to have enjoyed Shang-Chi when that movie was initially released. And I remember when I went to go watch it, I sat down in the theater with a bunch of my friends, and the entire time I was watching this film, I remember thinking, I feel absolutely nothing. I do not care about Sean in the slightest. This man is a big fat zero to me. I'm not invested in his journey. He has no arc. He has no motivation. I honestly felt like I was gaslit by the entire public into believing that Shang-Chi was good and supposedly the best MCU origin story since Iron Man. I don't think we were watching the same movie because I found it to be incredibly mediocre. But all of this is to ask, who are the main characters in the MCU now? Who is the new big three? I did an interesting experiment where I have combed through all of the Phase 4 and Phase 5 projects to this date, trying to assess who is the most recurring character in all of these films and TV shows, and I genuinely think the answer would surprise you. As of right now, the character that has appeared in the most MCU projects since the conclusion of Avengers Endgame is Yelena. That's right, Black Widow's younger sister is the character that has appeared in the most MCU projects since the Infinity Saga came to a conclusion. That is really telling in my opinion. I like Florence Pugh. I think she's an incredibly talented actress, especially when she is in, real films. But I do think it's a bit of a strange decision to have what is essentially the successor to Black Widow be the most common recurring character in the MCU since they have been trying to move forward with this new plan. Part of this speaks to how difficult it is to maintain a cinematic universe as opposed to starting one and building one. I think the MCU clearly had growing pains when it first began, which a lot of people seemingly conveniently forget because they view everything through these rose-tinted glasses now. And I understand. I was a big fan of the MCU. I watched all of the movies in theaters with my friends, but the truth is the MCU was not this perfect, flawless franchise that a lot of people try to make it out to be. The reality is that the MCU has always been a remarkably consistent franchise that consists of pretty okay to occasionally good films that culminate in these really exciting event movies. And the truth is, the MCU is just having trouble sustaining a universe now that they are several years into it and they have lost several of their main cast members. Films and Stuff made a really great video about Marvel's approach to the MCU and how it is different to launch a cinematic universe compared to trying to sustain one. He argues in his video that the MCU has basically stopped focusing on making good standalone films. Rather, they are focusing too much on trying to interweave all of these movies into a grand narrative, which again only furthers my argument that I don't think the overarching narrative of the MCU is as important as getting these standalone films right. Films and Stuff makes a very creative analogy. He compares the MCU to the film Moneyball, and in Moneyball, the strategy is essentially taking a bunch of players who aren't superstars on their own. They're not going to be hitting home runs during every other at-bat. Rather, these guys just know how to get on base. And he compares this strategy of roster building in baseball to what the MCU did in its early days. The MCU was not focused on Avengers Infinity War, which is not happening for who knows how many more years. The MCU was focused on, let's make Captain America the Winter Soldier the best movie we can. Let's try to make Guardians of the Galaxy appeal to wider audiences. That strategy has largely been abandoned by Marvel Studios and Kevin Feige. This, I do think, is an absolutely valid and true criticism of the MCU that is an issue. That said, I do not believe it is the reason that the MCU is experiencing the downfall that it is. As I stated earlier in the video, the reason the MCU has declined so precipitously since the release of Avengers Endgame, quite frankly, in my opinion, the MCU started to decline before Avengers Endgame. I honestly believe the wheels started to fall off around Ant-Man and the Wasp. And the reason for that is because if you look at Ant-Man and the Wasp, Captain Marvel, and Spider-Man Far From Home, it feels like all three of those movies could have been directed by the same person. Which is to say, they felt like they were directed by no one. And this is an issue that still plagues the MCU to this day, and it is the single biggest reason that Marvel is failing. I've kept you in suspense long enough. I've alluded to it several times throughout the video, but the time has arrived. The single biggest reason that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has declined so significantly since the release of Avengers Endgame is that these movies have zero intentional direction. And what I mean when I say that is that these movies have no intentionality when it comes to the filmmaking of these movies. And that is a huge problem. This is the single biggest issue with the MCU right now, and it is the reason that all of these movies feel like bland, soulless corporate products. It is the reason that Kate Shortland said that Marvel Studios told her not to worry about the third act of Black Widow because it was already being done in pre visualization. She was told to not worry about an entire third of her film because the hands of Marvel Studio started to creep in, the hands of Kevin Feige, the hands of the mouse. When I say there is no intentional direction, that is the reason that movies like Ant-Man and the Wasp, Captain Marvel, Spider-Man Far From Home feel like these movies have no director. These movies don't feel like they were made by an artist with a voice. They don't have anything to say. They're not interesting from a visual perspective. There is nothing about the choices made in any of those movies or any of the Marvel movies that have been made since that suggests that the filmmakers were actually given creative freedom over the movies they were hired to make. That is wrong. Not only does it deprive the filmmakers of an opportunity to give their career a significant boost, but it robs Marvel of becoming exciting and artistic and bold. They are only holding themselves back by continuing to handicap filmmakers. The first time I noticed that this was a true issue with the MCU was when I watched Captain Marvel. I walked out of the theater with my friend and I felt that there was something wrong with the movie, but I couldn't explain it. It just felt soulless to me. I felt like no one made that movie, which is a crazy thing to say because thousands of people work on movies of these size. But the movie just had no voice, and I couldn't articulate it at the time. But sure enough, as the movies continued to progress, with movies like Spider Man Far From Home and eventually Black Widow in 2021, what I realized is that these movies have no intentional direction. These movies are not actually planned. They are not being planned in the sense that the directors are not making choices in terms of the shots. They are not making choices in terms of the lighting or the blocking or the composition. Nothing is happening in these Marvel movies that suggests that there is any sort of creative thinking going on behind the scenes. It is very clearly a production that is controlled by the producers and the creative executives at Marvel Studios. That is an issue. When I sat down to watch Black Widow, I started to feel something was very off. And the reason for that is because when the dinner scene happened and Natasha was sitting down with her family, I noticed something very strange. The editing in that scene was a little off to me. And the reason I use the word off is because this is supposed to be Natasha's movie. It is supposed to be told from her perspective. This is her story. Yet during this dinner scene, I never felt like the camera or the editing was putting me in the perspective of Natasha Romanoff. Instead, what I would get is I would get a scene with Yelena and it would cut to Red Guardian at a completely different angle, and then it would cut to Natasha's mom and it would cut to Natasha, and the camera angle was constantly jumping from one to another. Now, to be clear, it's not abnormal for camera angles to change from shot to shot, but it is the way with which it was happening and the way that it was combined with the editing that suggested it is very obvious that these movies are shot for coverage. And what I mean by that is these movies are shot in a way where the directors, the assistant directors, they will roll out 6 cameras, place them in front of the actors, call action, and as soon as they have what they need, they yell cut, and that's it. There is no intentionality to anything that is happening in these movies, and that is a major issue. Black Widow was the first time that I was really able to identify and try to articulate this problem. But the straw that broke the camel's back for me was none other than Spider Man No Way Home. And I know that is not going to be a popular opinion because a lot of people love that movie, and I understand why. It is a cinematic event. It brought together the three Spider-Men that we have seen on the big screen. It was unprecedented. We've never seen anything like it. But Spider Man No Way Home represents everything wrong with the MCU. Why? Why does Spider Man No Way Home look so terrible? I have never seen a Spider Man movie look so visually uninteresting. That movie is ugly. There is no discernible sense of space or tangible reality. Great actors are shot in lined up singles put in front of a green screen and work with nothing. These scenes are then edited together with another talented actor who is shot reacting, again isolated in front of a separate green screen. Marvel movies have lacked inspired direction for a long time now, but it has never felt so apparent to me than it did in Spider Man No Way Home. The spatial continuity and visual rhythm of the film has never felt more off. The CGI is half baked, and the movie even reuses footage from Spider Man 3 and Amazing Spider Man because they couldn't be bothered to do anything new for this film. John Watts does not have a voice in Spider Man No Way Home. The movie does not feel like it was made by an artist with a voice. There are brilliant little flourishes of filmmaking skill throughout Spider Man No Way Home, such as the use of a snorri cam for one of Spider Man's swinging scenes, or a very aptly timed dolly zoom, but the movie completely lacks intentional direction. John Watts, like many other directors before him, was trapped in the MCU's hamster wheel of bare bones, flatly lit, and poorly color graded medium shots. There's no other word to describe this movie from a visual standpoint than lifeless. There's no depth or texture to the cinematography. There is a complete lack of visual style and interesting technique, and it gets in the way of storytelling, and character. Why do Marvel movies look like a used parking lot? All of these movies look like gray sludge, and it is a damn shame. Avengers Endgame is one of the most expensive films ever made, and at times it is a truly breathtaking spectacle to behold. But for far too much of its runtime, Avengers Endgame looks like gray sludge. It is a flat, ugly movie. Why on this green earth is the epic finale to the Infinity Saga taking place in a disgusting, ugly brown crater? What kind of decision is that? The MCU also has this habit of lining actors up in these disgusting and uninspired single medium shots where the depth of field is so shallow because they want you to think that they have a really tight focus on the actor. But in reality, it is because they cannot be bothered to build a set, shoot on location, or work these already overworked visual effects artists to finish the scene. Marvel is fooling you. There is no intentionality or creativity behind these movies anymore. Again, I will refer you to Spider Man No Way Home. Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield make appearances as their respective Spider-Men in this film. This is a once in a lifetime experience. You and I will never get to experience it again, but it doesn't change the fact that Maguire and Garfield's grand return unfolded in boring medium shots. This scene was written and staged in Ned Leeds' grandmother's house. What? What kind of decision is that? I wish such a monumental moment in cinema was a little more awe-inspiring, and the same can be said for the Spider-Man villains. Putting all of these iconic Spider-Man villains into Happy Hogan's New York apartment while they sit around waiting for Peter to help them felt like a bad Saturday Night Live sketch. Nobody knows how to neuter epic iconography quite like Marvel. Spider-Man swinging has never felt so lifeless and uninteresting. It's not done with nearly as much style, clarity, or punch as what Mark Webb did in 2012 or even what Sam Raimi did back in 2002. Seeing three Spider-Men swinging on screen will always garner applause, but it doesn't change the fact that these movies look like murky pre-visualization full of gray and brown. Unfortunately, the problem only started to metastasize from there as each subsequent Marvel release saw the homogenization of filmmaking. At one point, a Marvel producer named Victoria Alonso was let go from the studio, and she made the claim that a lot of Marvel movies are not made by the directors. Rather, they are made by Marvel Studios. And that is the problem here. If the MCU wants to reclaim any kind of identity, if the MCU wants to generate excitement, if they want to get back to their former glory, the MCU has to allow the filmmakers to make the movie they want to make. You cannot hire someone like Kate Shortland and then take the movie away from her in the third act, a movie that she probably busted her ass to make, trying to give it her own voice and style, which you clearly see in the first third of the film when she is trying to make it a gritty, visceral spy thriller in the vein of Mission Impossible, but then the movie descends into this ridiculous science fiction nonsense full of bad CGI and the ugly, uninspired cinematography. There is nothing interesting happening with the framing, the composition, the blocking. These shots are not planned at all. And what I mean when I complain about all of this is look at a movie like The Batman. When people saw the trailer for The Batman for the first time, most people were blown away. They were captivated by the look of that film and they couldn't quite explain it. Why does it look that way? Why does it feel so different? I'll tell you why. It's because Matt Reeves and Greg Fraser planned those shots. They storyboarded those shots, framed them, and then shot them in a very specific way, and they would not quit until they got the shot and the take that they wanted. That is the difference between a movie like The Batman and Spider-Man No Way Home. If you enjoy Spider-Man No Way Home or any Marvel movie post Avengers Endgame, that is fine. I'm not trying to take away from your enjoyment. I'm glad that you still enjoy these movies. I wish I did. But if you can honestly look me in the eye and say that a film like The Batman and Spider-Man No Way Home were made with the same level of intentionality, care, thought, and passion, you are a liar. Marvel movies are not inspired anymore, and it's because there is no intentional direction, no creative freedom given to the filmmakers. Look at the countless list of directors that have left Marvel Productions due to creative differences with the studio. Patty Jenkins, Edgar Wright, Scott Derrickson. It is a fucking miracle that Sam Raimi got to interject any of his personality into Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. And to this day, I still think that is one of the better MCU projects since Avengers Endgame. And the reason is specifically because I at least see a little bit of Raimi in that film. I don't care about the cameos. I don't care about the non-complaints people have with America Chavez. What I care about is that the movie actually feels like it was directed by an artist. I can see the flourishes of Sam Raimi. I can see his style. I can see his flair in the shots with Wanda, where he's trying to give it a little bit of campy horror, where he's trying to make it creative. He's trying to gross you out a little bit. I can see that the movie has actual contrast and thought put into the visual look of the movie. That is what I care about, and I cannot say the same for many other Marvel movies. The only Marvel movies that feel like they have been made by an actual person since Avengers Endgame are Multiverse of Madness and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Maybe you could make the argument for Wakanda Forever, but I think that's kind of pushing it. So many people are quick to point the finger at these really easy to identify issues with Marvel, like quantity over quality, like, oh, they don't have a plan for the overarching narrative of the MCU. They didn't map this out the way that they did with the Infinity Saga. That's all well and good, and to varying degrees, I'm sure that all of those are true. But the fact is, the single biggest issue facing Marvel Studios right now is that the directors don't have a voice. They are essentially being robbed of their agency, despite the fact that they have been hired to do this very specific job, and then that job is being taken away from them by the studio, by Kevin Feige. And I think that is a damn shame. Because in a cultural landscape where so many people complain about the movies that Hollywood chooses to put into production, the one constant that we seem to get are these superhero films. And instead of taking any risk, instead of making an artistic choice or doing something exciting, Marvel decides to use all of their money and brand power to suck the life out of every single project that they release. I want to say that I have faith that this problem will improve, but at this point, I really don't know because even Marvel's most recent release, Captain America Brave New World, ends up feeling like a sanitized, stitched together, watered down hatchet job. I have a really hard time believing this was the film that Julius Ona wanted to make, specifically because there are moments in Brave New World, similar to how there are moments in Spider Man No Way Home, that feel like Julius Ona was making an actual creative choice. He was doing something interesting with the camera or wanted to explore something interesting with the concepts and themes present in the film. Specifically, when Sam goes to visit Isaiah Bradley in prison, there is something really interesting about the camera angles in that scene, or even maybe the lensing choices that Julius Ona makes, because the scene feels so disorienting. It makes the audience feel uncomfortable. It makes us feel uncertain. And for a movie that clearly wants to be a political thriller, I wish we could have gotten more of that in the movie, but we just don't. And it's unfortunate because every single time it feels like we are approaching something interesting, or maybe the movie is actually going to say something of substance, the movie just pulls itself back because Marvel is too scared to touch on anything real. And I find it a little ironic that Brave New World ends up feeling this way because one of the worst aspects about Captain America Brave New World is that it is a backdoor sequel to The Incredible Hulk, a film that is 17 years old, but also a film that was ultimately a sanitized, stitched together, watered down hatchet job. It was not the film that Louis Leterrier or Edward Norton wanted to make. Hashtag release the Leterrier cut. Regardless of what you think about Edward Norton as a person, he is one of the best actors we have today, and he has stated multiple times he does not regret his decision to leave the MCU after The Incredible Hulk. He has no regrets about not continuing with the franchise because he felt so handicapped when he and Leterrier were making The Incredible Hulk. That movie was supposed to open with Edward Norton's Bruce Banner attempting suicide and ultimately failing because he turns into the Hulk and spits the bullet out. Instead, Marvel pulled back because that's a little too real, that's a little too serious, and instead they just decided to pay this scene that the audience has never seen and most people are probably never even aware of. They just decided to pay this scene lip service in the Avengers where everybody will clearly forget it because this movie is supposed to be a triumphant superhero spectacle team up movie. I wish I could say that I had hope for the future of the MCU, but right now I really just don't know. I'm tired. I'm so tired. It's difficult to distill Marvel's sharp decline into a single definitive reason. The truth is, it has probably been several issues that have compounded that resulted in this lifeless, unexciting, bland MCU that we currently experience in 2025. That said, the solution, in my opinion, should be relatively simple, which is to hand these films back over to the directors, hand these films back to the artist. That is the single biggest way to ensure that the MCU not only becomes interesting, but to regain audience interest. At this point, Marvel Studios and Kevin Feige already know that audiences have bought into the concept of this shared cinematic universe. You can't lean into that novelty idea anymore to sell these movies. You can't count on audience goodwill in order for these movies to turn a profit because that audience goodwill is wearing thin. And you also can't rely on these big event films anymore because Marvel is going to constantly try to either compare to or exceed Avengers Endgame. And I think the same can be said of audiences. So the only thing that is left to do, in my opinion, is to take chances on the solo films, make good standalone stories. Yes, this is a similar point to the one that Films and Stuff made in his video, and I will link that in the comment section below. But I think you not only need to focus on making good solo films that stand alone as self-sufficient stories, but you need to make good singular films in the sense that the movies have to be the work of an artist. They have to be the work of someone who has something to say. Now, of course, every director is not going to be David Fincher or Greta Gerwig. You aren't always going to hire filmmakers that have a clear and recognizable style or voice. But I think part of the appeal of directing movies like Marvel movies or DC movies is it gives filmmakers an avenue to develop their style, to develop their voice, and learn if they are interested in certain themes or concepts that they like to explore in movies, or to just overall help them find a visual style. Take some risk with the cinematography, take some risk with the blocking, take some risk with the composition. That's what Marvel should be doing at this point. I make it sound easy, but I'm fully aware that it's not. But I honestly believe that if the MCU wants to have any hope of a strong future, they need to give these films back to the artist. That is all that I have for you today. I have a brand new podcast that I recently launched called Below the Line Podcast. It is streaming on Spotify. You can check that out. If you are interested, you can subscribe if you'd like. Otherwise, that is all that I have for you today. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Peace, plants, namaste.